Our next speaker is Lauren Buttle. Lauren said she collected just about everything as a child, but she's been decluttering significantly on her way into adulthood. That must be music to Marie Kondo's ears. Today, Lauren Buttle is our paper conservator. Please welcome Lauren.
Thank you very much, Kim. My research today was prompted by a bit of housekeeping several months ago. While surveying a small collection of recently acquired material at the BC Archives, I came across 3 portraits that had been previously identified as solar portraits. For those of you who may not be familiar, solar enlargements are photographs, typically a salted paper print, that has been enlarged, touched up, and colored with crayons and paints, which is why they're also known as crayon portraits. These were very common in the 19th century. These particular portraits, the sitters were identified as British Columbia residents in typical 19th century dress. The paintings were carried out in ink, watercolor, and opaque watercolor on paper-lined silk with brocade borders. This is a medium and a mounting style that is very typical of Eastern art on paper. No emulsion layer was present, and upon examination under magnification, no evidence of photographic silver was found either. So these portraits are not appearing to fit comfortably within the category of solar enlargements, nor do they easily fall under any other category common in Victorian British Columbia. The combination of familiar and foreign attributes was very intriguing and posed several questions. Where did these paintings come from? Are they unique examples of one person's broad cultural and artistic experience? Or do they represent a larger trend in artistic practice? And if they are Eastern works, how did they come to be in British Columbia? So database searches revealed that other examples existed in our collection, as well as other North American collections, including a very interesting example, a scroll-mounted example of then President of the United States, Chester Alan Arthur, dressed in traditional Japanese samurai costume, held by the Albany Institute of History and Art. This seems to suggest a partial answer to one of my first questions. This is obviously a much larger trend rather than a one-off instance. A literature review revealed very limited sources, but led to informative consultation with colleagues in Japan. And ultimately, these paintings were identified as Yokohama-e. Yokohama-e are portraits and genre scenes painted in the realist style, often based on photographs, using traditional Japanese artistic materials on a silk ground. They have also been referred to as photographic paintings, realistic paintings, or shadow paintings. This fusion of traditional Japanese and Western elements is a unique form of Japanese art. It's also very emblematic of a complex and tempestuous area in Japanese history. Unfortunately, I don't have enough time to discuss the full social and political backdrop of this art practice with you today. But just as a quick refresher, this technique comes about the late 19th century, which is the end of the Edo period and the beginning of the Meiji period in Japan, a time of profound change. Almost 3 centuries of self-imposed seclusion come to an abrupt end, and suddenly Japan's trading posts are opened up wide for Western trade. It's a time when Japan is embarking on a period of modernization and rapid, zealous importation of all things Western. Among them is photography, and subsequently, a shift in artistic focus towards Western realism, which is achieved through shadowing and one-point perspective. By examining the examples we have in the BC Archives, I can say most of them have very similar general structures, with 1 or 2 exceptions. They're painted on a natural silk background and lined with thin, unbleached, uncolored Japanese paper. In at least 4 instances, these paintings are joined on all 4 edges with a paper-lined brocade fabric border and a thin strip of gold paper visible in between the 2 and connecting the 2. All of these composite pieces were then lined another time with Japanese paper. The media is ink, watercolor, and opaque watercolor. The literature suggests that these materials are the traditional materials of Japanese painters and scroll mounters. So this would be sumi ink, which is carbon or soot-based. Mineral pigments, white gofon, which is a white pigment made from crushed up seashells. Animal or vegetable coloring materials, and other natural pigments applied with an animal glue binder. In this instance, in the case of Rachel Lewis, you also see gold leaf was applied. The application of media is minimalist and intentional. The transition from shadow to highlight is extremely smooth, and in some cases, under magnification, almost undetectable. This is a very interesting juxtaposition to the highly detailed rendering of the hair, which at times seems to be built up with individual strokes representing individual strands. The use of opaque watercolor for the collars, detail highlights, and highlights around the eyes all give the subtle illusion of depth. Under the microscope, there are some instances of faint lines around the edges of the figure's clothing that are not covered over by subsequent buildup of media. These may be traces of initial preparatory drawings, but no other traces were found, which is pretty impressive. So we're getting a clear sense of what these objects are and roughly where they're from. How then did they come to be in British Columbia? This is a question that is still a bit fuzzy. Unfortunately, not a huge amount of provenance is attached to a lot of the examples we have at the BC archives. A study of Yokohama-e in general is difficult because most of the time these works were made for the tourist trade and subsequently were not signed or dated. So the answer to this question is still part of my research, requires a bit of detective work, and is still ongoing. My first thought to try and answer this question, though, was to look at the donor information. In the case of the Lewis family, there was already some confusion. On the back of this example, there was a graphite inscription that reads, "This picture is painted on silk and was done in China around 1890. Unfortunately, no original documentation in the donor file could confirm this assertion, though the file did have photocopies of the original photographs that the paintings are based on. I contacted the donor for more information and was told that it was unlikely, according to the personal family archives she still holds, that Rachel and Lewis had ever actually visited Asia themselves. I should note also that there's a second inscription alongside this first one, written in the same hand and with the same graphite, which identifies the sitter as Grandpa Lewis Lewis. This suggests that both inscriptions were made by a member of the Lewis family that's separated from the sitter by at least one generation. This may be important as it indicates that this is not necessarily a direct source, and that this assertion is being made several decades after the work is believed to have been completed. So there's reason to be slightly critical of it. I looked into the history of Chinese export painting, and there certainly is a similar trade thriving at a similar time. The paintings themselves, however, tend to take on a very different appearance. Chinese export paintings seems to be painted almost exclusively on paper or pith paper, and represent Chinese people in exotic contexts and still in a very stylized fashion. I couldn't find any reference to these more photo-like examples coming out of China. There are only 2 paintings in the BC Archives collections that do have signatures from the artists on them, and both explicitly identify the paintings as coming from Japan, and specifically from Yokohama. This and the, albeit limited literature, would suggest that this is quite a localized tradition in art, centered primarily in Yokohama, hence the name. Looking at another example, in the case of the Honorable John Robson, both the Yokohama-e portrait and the original photograph already exist in the BC Archives collection. This provides a bit more insight into the process of commission. The original photograph is a cabinet card, complete with the photo studio name and address printed on the recto. It reads Savannah, Five Sisters Block, Victoria, BC. According to CameraWorks, an online database for early photographers and studios in British Columbia, Savannah's was owned and operated by John Savannah for many years, but was only located at the Five Sisters Block between 1892 and approximately 1903. John Robson also died in 1892, therefore we can say that this photograph must have been taken in the last year of his life. If we assume that the painting was commissioned around the same time as the photograph, the date for this Yokohama-e portrait is similar to those of the Lewis family, if we are judging that by the inscription on the back of Lewis Lewis. So far the date is corroborated, but I suspect that China is still a misattribution. The cabinet card also confirms that the photograph was taken in British Columbia, rather than Japan. The BC Archives holds a collection of Robson's papers, and there is no reference to him traveling to Asia during the last year of his life. So again, much like the Lewis family, it seems unlikely that the sitter would have actually gone to Japan to commission the painting himself. It's possible that this photograph traveled with a friend or family member who commissioned the work. Another possibility that I believe to be more credible is the existence of an agent operating a trade business in Victoria or possibly a nearby city that acted as a broker for these deals, accepting fees and photographs in North America and sending these materials to Japan for production of these portraits. If the agent was operating out of maybe Chinatown or dealing with a variety of Asian goods of various origins, this may explain the misattribution to a Chinese artist. However, this is all still conjecture at this point. As I said, my research is ongoing. So I hope this short presentation has excited some interest in a unique and previously unidentified art form. It's a small collection that we hold at the moment, but there's a wealth of information to be gleaned from it. That all speaks to the early beginnings of an indirect visual relationship between Japan and Canada. As I mentioned, research into this art form and specifically how these works were brought to BC is still ongoing. So I'd love to take this opportunity to invite anyone who believes to have anything similar to this in their own personal collection to please feel free and encouraged to come find me at the engagement tables after the presentations. I would love to know more about what's here in BC, and especially if you have any documentation about how it came to be in BC. So thank you very much for your time, and thank you to my colleagues for donating a lot of their time and contributions to my research.